2024 was a very weird reading year for me. I read a lot of things that were just kind of out of my reading comfort zone or out of the normal things that I read. In particular, I was on the Prince Award Committee this year, which meant that most of my reads were confidential because it's an awards committee and we can't talk about what we read until after we give out the award. But I did also, alongside that, make a promise to myself to continue reading things that I enjoy reading. So I said I wanted to read 40 books purely for my own pleasure, and I did do that. I think I actually read 41. So I had a very small list of books to pick from for a top 10, but I do have a top 10. I can't share any of the Prince Reads books, but I can share my top 10 from those 40, and I'm going to share that with you today. And these are going to be in no particular order because it was just too much for me to try to decide. They're just such varied genres that trying to put them against each other didn't make a lot of sense for me. So we're just going to kind of say this is the top 10 in no particular order. One of the earliest books I read in the year was The Silence That Binds Us by Joanna Ho. This is the story of a girl who is dealing with the aftermath of her brother's suicide. So our main character, May, short for Maybelline, is very close to her brother, Danny, but one day he goes home and doesn't come back. And she and her family are reeling from that grief. And while that's happening, a member of the community gets up in front of everybody at the school and kind of accuses her family of having sort of a pressure on their child as a result of being an Asian family. And this kind of sets off May and her friends in a protest against this notion because it is rooted in racism and it is not how she wants her family to be thought of, and it is not how she wants her brother to be remembered. So she decides that she's going to use her voice, and she deals with the complications of protesting and how it affects her family and the choices that she has to make to try to stand up against this injustice, to speak out and speak back. She's using her words both in the written form and verbally, and it was just a really beautiful exploration of grief, and I thought it was really, really well done. So this was one of my favorite reads of the year, especially in terms of YA books that weren't 2024 releases. Going a little further back than that, I read Tender Morsels by Margot Lanigan, which I had a love-hate relationship with when I was reading it originally, but has really stuck with me throughout the year. I was reading this because it is a former Prince Award winner, and I was trying to read some of the previous Prince books before I was on the Prince committee. And this is, I think, a 2008 release, or a 2008 winner. And it is the story of, it's like a fairy tale type story. It's based on Snow White and Rose Red, but it's the story of this mother named Liga. It starts out very dark, like the opening bits of this are some of the darkest chapters I've ever read in a YA book. And it is because these dark events that start the story and that end up with Liga becoming pregnant result in them kind of being thrust into this magical world where nothing is bad. And so the two daughters, Branza and Erda, are being raised in that world and they've never known anything bad, but sometimes little pieces of the real world come into that world and sometimes they are able to go back out into the real world, and it is the story of the complications of that for both sisters and their mother. The thing that's really complicated about this is Margot Lanigan has a very heavy writing style, a very lyrical writing style that is not really my favorite. A lot of people really love it. It's very poetic, it's very beautiful, but to me, sometimes it felt a little bit overwritten. But then when I look back at this story, the way that it developed and the way that the fantasy world came together, it was, I think, a really strong, it's like a masterclass in writing a good book. It's definitely one that's labeled as YA. I question how much the actual YA audience is reading this, but I think for people that want to read this type of sort of fantastical story with very dark elements and teenage protagonists, if you're willing to step into that YA world as an adult, I think it would be a very lovely read. So I think I rated this one originally 3.5 stars. I think it's closer to a 4.5 now because of the way it's just stuck with me over the year. And that hasn't been the case for a lot of the things I read early in the year, so this one definitely stands out. I didn't read a lot of YA this year, but most everything else I read was adult books because I was trying to read things that weren't YA because I was reading so much YA in the rest of my life. I did read a romance novel. I read a few. This is the one that stands out for me. Talia Hibbert's Brown Sisters trilogy is incredible. I've enjoyed the other ones in this series, and Actor Age Eve Brown is the third one in this trilogy about each of the sisters finding love. And this one is about the youngest sister, Eve, and she's kind of the baby of the family. And it's her journey, maturing a little bit, being open to a relationship with Jacob, whose family owns a B&B. And she's trying to hold down a job. She's trying to do grown-up things. It doesn't always go well. You definitely have some neurodivergence stuff going on throughout this family. And I love the way that Talia Hibbert kind of handles disability and neurodivergence. and just like differences with the sisters and how they are still able to be just incredibly well-drawn women and really fun characters to read. And that was certainly the case with Eve Brown as well. So actually, I think she ended up being my favorite sister. I was worried that I would find her like, the baby sister. I didn't know that I would like her very much, but she was super fun to read, and I really enjoyed her romance with Jacob, and this was definitely also in the 5-star category. A lot of what I read in general is nonfiction. I really love listening to nonfiction on audiobooks. I consider them just like podcasts that go on for hours, which is absolutely up my alley. But one that I did read in print this year was The Ex-Evangelicals. I had an ARC copy of this through NetGalley. Really enjoyed it so much that I ended up buying it because this is the author's exploration of leaving the evangelical church. It's her journey with, it says, loving, living, and leaving the white evangelical church. So she's covering racism, she's covering the evangelical movement, and her movement to like deconstruct and get out of the church. So it's a very personal journey, but it's one that I've watched a lot of my friends go through. It's one that I've been very interested in just because of the current political landscape in our country and things that are happening in my own community. And that will be a theme in some of the other books that I share on this list as well. But this is maybe not my favorite memoir of all time, but of the things I read this year, this definitely rose to the top because I enjoyed the reading experience. I enjoyed her writing, I enjoyed her story, and I just, for a print book or an ebook that I was reading from NetGalley, it moved very quickly. And I had a lot of sympathy and empathy for her. I gave this one 4 stars. Probably my favorite read of the year, though, was The Defectors by Paula Ramos. And I was not familiar with Paula Ramos before I read this book. She is a news anchor, or she does news for the Latina community. And this is her book talking about, as you can see, or you might not be able to see, the rise of the Latino far right and what it means for America is the subtitle on this book. It is talking about pre-election, because this came out obviously before the 2024 election results, talking about how the Latino community has swung far right and why people would make that movement when it seems counterintuitive to the needs of that community. And she breaks this down into sort of thematic reasons. So I really liked the structure of this book. I listened to it on audiobook. It was a really readable audiobook. I really liked Paula as a person, just like the little bits of herself that we could see in this story. And this ended up being my favorite read of the year, partially because of its timeliness with the election, with my community, and just like some of the narratives that we're hearing in the news about what happened that election. It was really useful to get that extra context for things, at least from this particular person's point of view, and to just get some understanding. Every time we have an election, there's communities we learn more about that their needs aren't being met or why they did something that we weren't expecting, and this book gave that context. I read 2 other books that I don't have here in print, but they were both about the infrastructure of the worlds that we live in. So it was interesting to me that I found both of them to be in my top 10 of the year. They were Hidden Systems and City Limits. And so Hidden Systems is a YA graphic novel that covers the electric grid, the internet, and the water systems that affect our world and how they're, like, what that even means. Like, what is the electric grid? What is internet, and where does it come from? But what I really liked about this book, it's a graphic novel. It broke down those concepts really well for me, but it also talked about inequalities in those systems and who those systems hurt even when they were created, like whose land things were being built on, who has access to those things and who doesn't have access to those things. And then just like what alternatives might be for some of those systems as well, like where we might go with that in the future. And I found that very eye-opening, and it helped me understand a little bit better just some of the things that are happening literally around me right now. There's water moving through the pipes, there's internet moving through the air, I have power that's powering things around me and the lights in the room, and how like actually incredible that is. Like, it is incredible how far and how long it took to get us to this point where we have access to these things in our home, and how that network spreads literally around the world. Like, I was completely flabbergasted by that. And then also City Limits is a story of the highway systems in the United States. In particular, it was told through a couple of different cities and kind of honing in on movements to like add a road or build up roads and things in those cities and how that affected people in those communities, because it's about the inequalities created from particularly highway systems that are going through certain parts of cities. Because which parts of cities do we put highways in? It is parts where there are low income people who are not going to fight the roads being put through their neighborhoods. So literally houses being across the street from a bodega, and now there's a highway separating them from that bodega, and what that does to the people that live in those communities. People who have a home and then they are being forced to sell their home so the road can be built over top of that, and what that does to their neighborhood. So I found it really fascinating, especially because the stories were so personal, which is why this made that one of my favorite reads of the year. And then finally, I have a book club with my teacher friends at school, and we pick a book every month. We take turns picking the book, and there were 3 that really stood out from that. I think we read a grand total of 12 this year. I had already read a few of them, so maybe 9 of them were new to me, and 3 of them ended up on this list. Song of Solomon was definitely one of them. I want to read more Toni Morrison. I always want to read more Toni Morrison. So when one of my book club friends picked this one, I was very excited because it put it on a priority list for me to read this year. And let me tell you, this book is a hard read. There's a lot going on here. It's kind of got an intergenerational story, but it's also a coming of age story. And one thing that Toni Morrison does really well is she uses symbolism incredibly, like just the names, like every little thing in these books and the biblical allusions and things like that are so well drawn that you feel like when you read her books, you're like, I know I just read something really, really good. Let me read it again and take notes. Like, I want to go take a class so we can talk about this in class and I can write an essay so that I can fully understand everything that's happening here. And I don't know about you, but I love that. That's a kind of reading that I really enjoy. And especially because we read this for book club, I did enjoy that we got to go sit and drink a warm beverage together and kind of dissect pieces of this book and talk about different interpretations that we had and break things down. So in that sense, I got a lot of enjoyment, not only out of the reading experience, but the discussion experience for this. So that was a delight and also just a wonderful memory, and why this book ended up being a top 10 of the year. One of my picks for the book club this year was Evil Eye by Itaf Ram. Part of this is because of the situation in Palestine. I wanted to read books by Palestinian authors, and funnily enough, I picked this one thinking it was one that I already had. I got it confused with another one of her books that I had got from Book of the Month Club. So then I ended up not being able to read the one I already had, and I had to then go buy this one anyway. So now I'm going to read both of them. But this is, you know, it is a Palestinian author. She's a Palestinian immigrant to the United States. She's in a marriage. It's not a happy marriage. So this is the story of the main character's journey to finding herself, to stepping outside of what has been kind of her path that she's been on. There's a particular person in her life that maybe makes her realize that she wants a little bit more than she has. Things aren't going well at work either. So she has a lot of opportunities to kind of spread her wings and figure out where she wants to go next, what she wants to do in life. And so that was a very relatable story. She does have children. And so it's kind of one of those literary fiction novels where a lot of it is just about the character study and what's going on in her life more so than the plot. But I really enjoyed the character here, so I really enjoyed the book. On a side note, we wanted to go visit Itaf Ram's coffee. She owns a bookstore and coffee shop near us, about an hour away, and we were going to go visit it and like, be like, hey, we read your book and we really love what you had to say, but the ownership changed over before we could get there, so I'm really bummed that we never got to go to the bookstore coffee shop and buy a book, buy a coffee, and like wave at Itaf Ram from across the room. But you know, maybe we'll get a chance to do that another day, because clearly she lives near enough by. But for right now, we're just going to pick up the next book and read that instead. And then finally, I absolutely love Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I have not read any other Barbara Kingsolver books, so I went into this not comparing it to anything else, but I picked it for 2 reasons. This was one of my picks for the book club. I picked it because, number one, it mentions the town that I grew up in. So I grew up in Christiansburg, Virginia, which becomes a very symbolic town in this book. For Demon Copperhead, who is a foster child living in Appalachia, in the very pointiest part of the state of Virginia. And he really wants to see the ocean. And so sometimes when he's trying to get there, Christiansburg, which being symbolic because it says Christian in the name, I guess, is the point where he like can never get past to get to the ocean. But it is based on, or it is related to David Copperfield. There's a lot of characters that like, it's very closely related to that book. She's definitely borrowing a lot from that. But it is the journey of Demon Copperhead as he goes through a lot of really hard things in life. So the second reason I wanted to read this book is because the New York Times, I think, made a list of the best books of the 21st century so far, and this was number 1. So I wanted to know, like, this is a Pulitzer Prize winner. This is, you know, the New York Times thinks this is one of the best of the century so far. I want to read this book. It is a tome, but it's a very actually readable tome. It gets really like dark at the, well, it's dark throughout, but like there's some scary scenes at the end where you're just like, can someone give this poor kid a break? You know, he goes through multiple foster homes. He watches multiple tragedies happen. His mother, you know, has a really complicated history with things, obviously, because he's in foster care. You just want to give this kid a hug and you want him to like go through the ocean and live a good life, but there are so many barriers in the way for him doing that. So, you know, do be prepared if you're interested in books like this. There's a lot going on. You have to be kind of in the right mindset to read it, but I was in the right mindset, and I did see that this was an incredible read. And you know, it was so interesting just to see the area that I grew up in, how it was represented with a lot of nuance in this story, which I appreciated. So those are all of my favorite reads of 2024. You know, with only 40 books, there were fewer to pick from for a top 10, so it was a little bit harder than in a normal year where I might read like 100 or 150 books. So it was interesting what things ended up being on this top 10 that might not have been on a top 10 in another year. But I was really glad to be able to do some reading for myself, and these books all allowed me to do that. I got to enjoy just some reading for me, which was very important in this year. And if you have read any of these and want to share your thoughts on them, I would love to hear it. Even if your thoughts are that you disagree with me and didn't like these as much as I did, or find something that I need to know about any of them, I would appreciate that. Or if you just want to gush over them with me, I also appreciate that too. And here's to having an awesome reading year also in 2025, because now I can read anything I want and the world is my oyster. I have so many things lined up, and I'm very excited about the many books that I've already got on my TBR for January, much less the rest of 2025.